The United States government sending its military to Venezuela to arrest their president and bring their president to our country to stand trial has a significant number of legal issues. I mean, it's like being at the buffet. There's a little bit of everything. However, I will try to help you navigate what I believe some of the issues will be involved in the prosecution and the defense of that case. Now, you might find this interesting, but this is not the first time our country has done this. 30 years ago, the Bush administration sent the military to Panama to arrest the dictator/president Manuel Noriega and actually brought him to the country for similar allegations, drug charges and drug trafficking. So what can we expect to come from the prosecution and the defense of the president of Venezuela? Join me in a legal deep dive and let's find out. What's good, people? I hope everybody had a great holiday season. Mine was good. Of course, I made two mistakes. The first one is taking way too many days off. And by too many, I mean 3. Because, even when I'm off and I'll say I'm off, I'm not really off. I'm still, doing video conferences, still on the laptop, still on the PC. So I'm technically not in the office, but I'm not really off. And it's really not much of a break, but I still end up being behind by the time I go back to work. So that was the first mistake. So my second mistake was on Christmas Eve, leaving the meat on the grill unattended. So I get this prime rib from one of my favorite restaurants for Christmas Eve dinner, and I get it home and it looks great. Seasoned, brown, perfect. But I open the thing up, and to say that it's undercooked will be an exaggeration. I mean, I could still see the heart beating on the thing. So no problem, right? I just slice some pieces up. I got a grill, real nice outdoor kitchen. I put it on the grill on the low setting and close the hood. So I'm gonna start by giving you some free advice. If you have fatty red meat on the grill and your wife says, "Hey babe, why don't you come sit with us and open presents?" Just say no. Because when you don't, guess what happens? In fact, don't believe me, I have it on video, my grill caught on fire. And if you look, you'll see an actual video taken by my daughter of my grill on Christmas Eve on fire and me getting a fire extinguisher to put the fire out. So those are my 2 big mistakes during the holiday season. So this is my first podcast of 2026. Before we start, do me a favor, go ahead and like and subscribe so you get all my legal updates and maybe see me setting more shit on fire. So United States government indicted the president of Venezuela for something called narco trafficking. Basically what that means is, allegedly, that the president of Venezuela has been using his government authority and resources to facilitate the trafficking of illegal drugs into the United States. As a result, the government, on the direction of the president, sent the military to Venezuela, arrested him and his wife at the presidential palace, and brought them back to the United States to stand trial. And as I indicated earlier, there will definitely be some significant legal issues and hurdles in the prosecution and defense of this case. But there is some guidance based on the prosecution of Manuel Noriega 30 years ago. And by looking at those cases, we can get an idea of some of the issues that are going to be addressed in this case. Now, out of the gate, the first issue that comes to mind is the president bypassing congressional authority. Now, only Congress has the authority to declare an act of war on another country. That's in our Constitution. The president needs congressional approval. Well, in this case, the president did not obtain congressional approval. In fact, he didn't even tell Congress he was doing it. He just did it. So in his own volition, the president sends the military to another country, arrests the president, and then publicly states to the world that the United States is going to start running Venezuela. Sort of sounds like declaring war. However, since this type of presidential action is unprecedented, it's difficult to determine exactly, number one, how Congress could respond, and number two, how would they respond? And when I say how could they respond, what action could they really take? I mean, you can't put the bullet back in the gun at this stage. I can't imagine the Congress would say, hey, you shouldn't have done that. Put them on a private plane and take them back. I mean, they're not going to do that. Regarding how they would respond, I mean, at this point, Congress is so politicized that it would take a majority of the congressional cabinet to really make any type of decision regarding a sanction or corrective action. And since the Republicans have the majority, that's just not going to happen. So I think from the standpoint of any type of congressional kickback or response, I don't think that's anything the president has to worry about. The next issue that comes to mind is whether or not the Venezuelan president was illegally arrested. Now, on the surface, that argument does seem to make sense. He's a sovereign president in another country. The military from a different country comes to his country and takes him into custody without due process, without a search warrant or an arrest warrant. That seems to be a pretty valid argument. So while I do expect them to make arguments about due process and lack of jurisdiction, unfortunately, as Manuel Noriega found out, when it comes to United States courts, once the defendant is brought before the United States courts in a criminal case, the court has decided they will not entertain any issues regarding how the defendant was brought into custody. So ultimately, they can make those arguments all day long till they're blue in the face, but in the end, the court's going to say, not our problem. So they're not going to have any luck with the lack of due process, illegal search and seizure, illegal arrest argument. There will be some question raised about whether or not the president of Venezuela has immunity. There is a rule called the head of state rule, which basically means that the head of state or the president of another country cannot be subject to criminal prosecution from another country. That's called the head of state rule. Now, undoubtedly, the defense will claim that the president of Venezuela should have immunity since he was the president and thus the head of state. However, there are two legal exceptions to that rule. The first one is the leader's country waives immunity. Now, I don't see that happening. I don't see the Venezuelan government waiving prosecution of their former president Maduro so the United States can prosecute him on drug charges. I just don't see that happening. The second exception is a prosecuting country no longer recognizes the arrested individual as the legitimate head of state of that country. And at that point, he stands in the same shoes as a private citizen. A situation like that's going to be when, let's say, you have a president that is unlawfully in power. Let's say he seized power by being a dictator and perhaps used the military to oust a former president or took control by power as opposed to the normal process for becoming an elected head of state for a particular country. That does happen. However, in cases like that, normally the country that's making the arrest recognizes someone else as a legitimate head of state for that country. The problem is the United States has not formally recognized anyone else as the official head of state for that country. In fact, now that the former vice president has now assumed power and is being considered and acknowledged as a head of state, the United States is actually formally and publicly causing and calling for some questions regarding her legitimacy as head of the state of Venezuela. Now, outside of the United States criminal courts, there are international laws that may be at play in this case. And under international laws, military use of force is prohibited as something to be used during negotiations between countries unless the force is necessary for self-defense. In other cases, the force must be authorized by the United Nations. Well, clearly self-defense does not apply in this case. And of course, the United Nations did not authorize this military action. They didn't even know about it. They found out the same way everybody else did. But the United Nations options are limited. I mean, at best, they could try to impose sanctions on the United States. However, number one, as a member of the United Nations, the United States can actually veto the sanctions, so they wouldn't have any practical effect. Plus, from a geopolitical standpoint, the United States is the most powerful member of the United Nations. So these other countries kind of getting together and deciding they're going to sanction our country, I think is very, very unlikely. particularly considering they know the temperament of our current president, who is quick to threaten war and, make threats of retaliation if anybody tries to, buck his administrative action. And I think it goes without saying that our current president couldn't care less about the opinions of the United Nations members. So counting on them to somehow resolve this conflict, sucker bet. I'm going to call it like I see it. Just as I've said in other podcasts, our president consistently tests the limits of presidential authority. We have seen he will not defer to the judicial system based on his administration's response to adverse legal rulings. I mean, he's not going to defer to the legislative branch. You've seen him bypass Congress by, declaring war on another country. And he certainly won't give deference to any so-called international laws. So there's no doubt that the Venezuelan president will be prosecuted and will stand trial in our courts. However, I don't think the case is going to go very smoothly. As we've seen so much over the last 6 months, this administration kind of does it backwards. They'll decide on the target and make the arrest and figure the rest out later. They have this ready, fire, aim approach to their prosecution, which is why you've seen so many cases get dismissed and thrown out due to technicalities, due to lack of evidence, because the administration typically doesn't do things the right way. They will pick the target, get the indictment, and then try to build a case. What you're supposed to do is make sure all that's done properly in the front end. You build your case, you make sure things are being done legally and properly, you have things lined up, then you take the person in custody, get the indictment, make the arrest, get the conviction. They typically don't do things that way. We've seen it with Letitia James' case, we've seen it with the James Comey case, we're seeing United States attorneys being removed from office because they're serving unlawfully. This whole thing of getting the indictment and making the arrest and worry about the details later is going to bite them in the butt on this case. Well, you might 100% agree with me or think I'm way off base. I really don't give a damn. Either way, do me a favor, post your comments and call it like you see it. That's it. Well, that's all I got, but I do appreciate you taking the time to join me on this legal deep dive. I think it's always fun to discuss these topics, tell you what I think, and get your feedback. I would really appreciate it if you took the time to like the video, subscribe to the podcast, and also I'd appreciate you sending me your comments so we can discuss the topics you want to hear about. That's it.